So, with this problem in mind, physicists are still hunting for dark matter, which would allow for the void of space to have the theoretical substance or chain links needed to push objects towards the ground or pull planetary bodies towards a curvilinear path, providing the necessary centripetal force to keep such bodies in their perpetual orbit around the larger body like the Sun, which is also in perpetual orbit around the galactic center, in theory, of course. You'd think such a massive, prevalent, fundamental force such as gravity would leave evidence of its existence all over the place. Much like gravity waves, which have never been detected and never will be detected, dark matter is a theoretical fantasy that only needs to exist in the heliocentric model, since gravity doesn't make any sense and is completely unnecessary since the Earth is not a spinning globe. Physicists will never find gravity's evil twin, dark matter, because neither of these things exist in reality, and they don't even theoretically need to exist. It's all theoretical fantasy, which is only necessary in a heliocentric universe with the spinning globe Earth model. The other issue I have with the conventional theory of gravity is the fact that our upper atmosphere, right at the edge of space, is so very thin and devoid of most density, temperature, and substance. What is preventing those sparse molecules of ultralight atmosphere from being sucked out into the infinite vacuum of space? A physicist will tell you it's gravity keeping the atmosphere fixed to the Earth, even at the altitudes right at the edge of so-called space, but that doesn't answer the question. Even one single atom of atmosphere at those levels would weigh more than all the space around it for millions of miles. So the idea that the void of space is keeping that atom or all those atoms of atmosphere stuck in place above the Earth is pure nonsense. Even a small child could see it's impossible and ridiculous. Try leaning up against a wall. Then take away the wall and try leaning up against nothing. It doesn't work. Just as the upper atmosphere cannot be held into place by the infinite vacuum of space. You can't lean on or be compelled into place by nothing, especially a vacuum. Now, keep in mind, mainstream physics asserts that the atmosphere of the Earth is spinning along with the face of the Earth, even miles up into the air at the edge of space. This is so preposterous because the atmosphere at those levels would need to travel faster and faster eastward as altitude is gained, just to apparently remain fixed above the ground below, but that's sort of besides the point. If gravity is theoretically stronger on the ground than it is, say, 300 miles up, then the amount of gravity compelling the high altitude atmosphere in place would be a lesser force than that of the gravity near the ground. So how is it possible for the weak force of gravity far from the face of the Earth to keep the sparse, cold, disparate molecules of air stuck to the Earth where they're directly adjacent to the infinite vacuum of space? Even if gravity was extremely powerful, which it admittedly isn't even in theory, it would not be powerful enough to prevent the atmosphere from expanding into the infinite vacuum of space as postulated in the heliocentric model. So I've made a few videos disproving gravity using a variety of logical experiments, demonstrations, and arguments. Check out Earth Not a Globe 2 or Disproving Gravity in 15 Minutes or Less for some background information. Since the Earth is not a spinning globe, we theoretically don't need gravity as we understand it, and therefore we don't need gravity's covert counterpart, the evil twin of gravity, or dark matter. That's also theoretically unnecessary. Hopefully we've established at this point that gravity is not caused by a warping of space-time, and the observation, what goes up must come down, is caused by something completely different than what we've been taught our entire lives. If you're not on the same page with me at this point, take a moment to watch the videos I've just mentioned so that we're all on the same page. It's difficult as a flat earther to make videos that will appeal to newcomers as well as veterans to the subject. If you get too complex, then you lose the newcomers, and if you only stick to the basics, then the veterans will get bored and go watch Honey Boo Boo or worse. They'll start watching videos about the dome in the sky. Who knows? Anyways, now that we're all on the same page, the first few points we're starting with are 1. What goes up must come down. 2. The Earth is not spinning. 3. The Earth is not a globe. 4. Gravity is not a warping of space-time. And 5, the laws of density and buoyancy generally explain what goes up must come down. However, we still need a tendency for down to be down and up to be up. This video is intended to describe an alternate hypothesis for the natural phenomenon formerly ascribed to quote-unquote gravity as a warping of space-time. For the sake of simplicity, I'll refer to the phrase gravity as describing an Einsteinian understanding of the described force, and I'll use the phrase natural balance to describe the alternate theory I'm ultimately outlining in this video, which is closely related to the laws of density and buoyancy. To give an example of natural balance, if you take several different types of liquids, like some water, some oil, and vinegar or whatever, and put them in a bottle and shake it up, if you set the bottle down and let it rest a while, when you come back later, the different types of liquids will eventually arrange themselves with the lighter fluids at the top and the higher density or heavier fluids towards the bottom. It's just a natural balance, and they will always find their way back to their proper place. Now, in order for this to work every time, there must be a tendency for down to be down. How does the higher density liquid know to find its way down? Why isn't the lighter liquid at the bottom? Pretty simple concept to grasp, but if you really think about the cause of such behavior of inanimate liquids, a tendency similar to gravity is still necessary even though the world is not a spinning globe. There must be a tendency for down to be down. Globists will point to this type of observation as proof of a globe. See, the higher density liquid finds its way down, so there must be gravity, and therefore we live on a spinning globe. To me, this is as logically incomplete as observing an apple fall from a tree and equating that to proof of the theory of gravity. Not to get too far into the weeds, but we must remember that gravity is a theory designed to explain observations, such as an apple falling from a tree. We simply cannot equate apples falling from trees as proof that the theory of gravity is correct, if I'm making any sense here. A crude analogy to illustrate the point could involve my smelly socks. If you ask me why my socks smell and I reply because trolls live in my shoes and they don't clean up very well, you'd think I was nuts, of course, but if I took off my shoes and my socks smelled, then there must be trolls living in my shoes, right? That's sort of the situation we have with gravity. Gravity is a theory designed to explain the tendency of objects to fall towards the ground, but the original observations cannot be used to prove the validity of the theory. At any rate, the point I'm getting at here is that the laws of density and buoyancy explain a lot in terms of observations of falling or floating objects. A hot air balloon will rise due to this principle, just as a beach ball will always rise to the top of water if it's held under the surface. Even though the water pressure is pushing down on the beach ball, so is the air pressure above that. Plus, you've got the force of gravity doing its thing to push down the beach ball. But in spite of all that, the beach ball simply obeys the laws of density and will always find its way to its natural place of rest, which would be at the surface of the water, in balance with nature, just as it should. In fact, density and buoyancy adequately explain the apple falling from the tree because the apple has a higher density than the air surrounding it and will naturally be attracted directly towards the ground. Furthermore, much like the heavier liquid finding its way beneath the lighter liquid like a vinaigrette, the apple will naturally find its way beneath the surrounding air due to the same principle. To take this a step further, an apple on top of Mount Everest will weigh slightly less due to the barometric pressure above the apple being less dense, just as an apple will weigh slightly more at the North Pole, at the center of the flat Earth, because the barometric pressure is at its highest towards the center of the map. As you travel south, away from the center, the barometric pressure drops lower and lower as you travel south and continues to drop even as you go south of the equator, which certainly doesn't lend itself to the globe Earth very well. So density, pressure, and temperature play a huge role in the natural balance. However, there's still something missing, and here's where I begin to theorize a force similar to gravity, but nothing akin to the force we commonly describe as gravity, being a warping of space-time by the mass of the Earth. If you consider that similar densities are vibrating at similar frequencies, or objects of similar density will possess a similar vibrational state, In other words, the apple fell from the tree and was attracted to the ground because it was of a similar density or a closer harmonic resonance with the ground than the air near the ground. The apple is actually attracted to the ground due to a principle similar to electromagnetism, but related to density and temperature and not the polarity of an object's electrons, nor a warp of spacetime. That's for sure. I think it's possible that the force we call gravity has to do with objects of similar density having a similar resonant frequency, or they're attuned to a similar harmonic resonance, and therefore will tend towards one another or be attracted to one another. So instead of thinking of density as compacted atoms, think of density as atoms resonating on a higher frequency than lower density objects. It's sort of like putting different types of fluids into a bottle, oils, waters, etc. When you shake up the bottle, the similar density fluids will coalesce once again eventually. This is because they are similar densities and will naturally find balance together. The higher density fluids will make their way to the bottom because they are of a closer resonant frequency to that of the ground than the lower density fluids, and the lower density fluids will make their way above the higher density fluids. So, if the ground itself is very high density, and the ground miles deep is even higher density than that, an apple will fall to the ground because it's of a similar density to the ground when compared to the air near the ground, and the air that was near the ground beneath the apple will be shoved aside to make way for the apple to find its way to the ground where it will remain at rest. Of course, the apple is not nearly as dense or as heavy as the ground, so it certainly won't pass through the ground, but it will find balance, a natural balance between the lower density atmosphere above and the higher density ground below. This has nothing to do with the mass of the Earth warping space-time, but because the apple is of a closer density frequency to the ground than the air near the ground. Now, with all that being said, there's another element involved. Even though the air itself is lower density than the apple, there's a column of air above the apple going many miles up into the sky, right to the edge of space, according to the conventional model. All that air, all that dense air is pressing down on the apple. So not only does the density of the apple compel it towards the ground, but the atmosphere above it is also pushing down on it due to the sheer volume of air above the apple finding its balance point and tending to remain at rest until a change in temperature or frequency affects it. Barometric pressure increases the force pressing on the apple towards the ground, depending on the barometric pressure at the given altitude and the temperature of the air. So, with all that being said, if you're in a high altitude flight, far higher than commercial jets, say 250 miles up, very similar to low Earth orbit, the ground is far enough away from the apple where the similar densities or vibrational states are far enough removed that the attraction between the ground and the apple would be decreased. Hence, the apple experiences less gravity. Furthermore, the barometric pressure inside the cabin might be similar to that of the ground, but you simply don't have a column of air many miles tall pushing down upon the apple inside the cabin, so the apparent weight is further decreased. On top of that, the high altitude flight could be traveling in a parabolic curve around the magnetic center of the flat Earth, along with the ether, and I can see this sort of thing creating conditions that would allow, say, NASA to fake zero-G, and could possibly even trick astronauts into believing they are orbiting a planet. Remember, when you're up at very high altitudes, the horizon line is an equidistant circle around you, and since you're not within the blue layer of atmosphere, instead of blue sky over the horizon, you see black sky over the horizon. This further adds to the illusion that you're orbiting a globe, and they use convex glass or plexiglass for the windows, which further adds to the illusion. It's pure nonsense. Even a small child could see it's impossible and ridiculous. Try leaning up against a wall. Then take away the wall and try leaning up against nothing. It doesn't work. Just as the upper atmosphere cannot be held into place by the infinite vacuum of space. You can't lean on or be compelled into place by nothing, especially a vacuum. Now, keep in mind, mainstream physics asserts that into the infinite vacuum of space. A physicist will tell you it's gravity keeping the atmosphere fixed to the Earth, even at the altitudes right at the edge of so called space, but that doesn't answer the question. Even one single atom of atmosphere at those levels would weigh more than all the space around it for millions of miles. So the idea that the void of space is keeping that atom or all those atoms of atmosphere stuck in place above the Earth is so with this problem in mind, physicists are still hunting for dark matter, which would allow for the void of space to have the theoretical substance or chain links needed to push objects towards the ground or pull planetary bodies towards a curvilinear path, providing the necessary centripetal force to keep such bodies in their perpetual orbit around the larger body like the Sun, which is also in perpetual orbit around the galactic center, in theory, of course. You'd think such a massive, prevalent, fundamental force such as gravity would leave evidence of its existence all over the place. Much like gravity waves, which have never been detected and never will be detected, dark matter is a theoretical fantasy that only needs to exist in the heliocentric model, since gravity doesn't make any sense and is completely unnecessary since the Earth is not a spinning globe. Physicists will never find gravity's evil twin, dark matter, because neither of these things exist in reality, and they don't even theoretically need to exist. It's all theoretical fantasy, which is only necessary in a heliocentric universe with the spinning globe Earth model. The other issue I have with the conventional theory of gravity is the fact that our upper atmosphere, right at the edge of space, is so very thin and devoid of most density, temperature, and substance. What is preventing those sparse molecules of ultralight atmosphere from being sucked out